Africa, there lies a story of unimaginable loss, survival and hope. This is the journey of the lost boys of Sudan. In 1956, Sudan gained its independence from Britain.
Read from the balcony of the House of Representatives in Khartoum, and the new flag is hoisted. Blue for the Nile, yellow for the desert, green for agriculture. A five-man Supreme Commission will act for the time being as head of state.
But a deep rift already existed between the country's north and south. The north was largely Arabic-speaking and Muslim, while the south was a mixture of Christians, Roman Catholics, indigenous religions, and even atheists. These cultural and religious differences were stark, and tensions simmered for years. The new Sudanese government, led by northern leaders, wanted to enforce Arabization and Islamization on the south, which clung to East African identity. The northern government sought to control the south's rich resources like oil and minerals, while the south fought to protect its land and way of life. These competing interests escalated into a brutal civil war. The war tore the country apart, and one of the worst victims of this conflict was children. As villages in the south were attacked, many children were orphaned and separated from their families. The brutal violence forced thousands of young boys to flee, and what followed was a terrifying, dangerous journey towards survival. Some of these boys managed to escape because they were tending cattle far from their villages when the disaster struck. Others were swept up in the madness and fled into the unknown. These young boys formed groups traveling together in search of safety, becoming known as the Lost Boys of Sudan. Imagine walking for weeks, sometimes even years, with nothing but the clothes on your back. No food, no water, only the hope that you would make it to safety. The journey of the Lost Boys was one of unimaginable hardship. They traveled on foot, sometimes in single file lines, walking through dense forests and across arid desert. Along the way, they were attacked by wild animals like lions. They faced constant threats of disease like malaria, pneumonia, and extreme dehydration. Food was scarce, and the boys had to rely on the kindness of strangers or still to survive. They often hunted for food, begged from villages they passed, or simply went without. As many as half of them died along the way, victims of hunger, disease, and attacks from soldiers. The journey was not just a physical battle, it was a mental and emotional struggle. These boys, often as young as 6 or 7, had no idea where they were going. The path was uncertain. Every day was a fight for survival. Eventually, some of the boys made it to refugee camps, first in Ethiopia, then in Kenya. But the horrors didn't end there. The camps were overcrowded and under-resourced. The United Nations and aid organizations were overwhelmed, struggling to meet the basic need of these young refugees. There were no adults to guide them. They came without guidance and were thrust into a life of survival. Many of the lost boys spent their childhoods and adolescence in these camps, with little to no formal education and no family to care for them. In these camps, these boys were given shelter, but their lives were far from stable. Some faced sexual violence and abuse, and others were forced into military services by rebel forces. The trauma they endured was unimaginable. These children were the most war-traumatized group ever studied by experts. In the early 1990s, after years of hardship, the world began to take notice of the Lost Boys. Between 1992 and 1996, some of them were able to reunite with their families, but there were still over 17,000 who remained in the camps struggling to survive. In 2001, the United States and the United Nations launched a resettlement program. Over 3,800 lost boys were given a new chance at life, resettled in cities across the United States. These boys began to rebuild their lives, starting from scratch in a new country. But the settlement wasn't easy. Many of the lost boys faced difficulties adapting to new lives. The scars of war were deep. The cultural shock made it hard for them to fit in. They struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder, separation from family, and the loss of everything they had ever known. In fact, 1 in 5 of the lost boys under the age of 18 was diagnosed with PTSD. The trauma they experienced in Sudan and along their journey never truly left them. South Sudan, once part of Sudan, became an independent nation in 2011.
The announcement of the final results of the referendum has marked the end of an era, and today is the beginning of a new era in our history.
South Sudan gained its independence on July 9, 2011, after decades of conflict, suffering, and sacrifice. Despite these immense struggles, the resilience and determination of the South Sudanese people never wavered. Their unwavering hope and fight for freedom led to the birth of a new nation.
With this newfound freedom, many of the lost boys returned to their homeland, eager to contribute to the rebuilding of their war-torn country. Some even held positions in the new government, playing a vital role in shaping the future of South Sudan. While the story of the lost boys is well known, the story of the lost girls is often left untold. Women in Sudan were treated as second-class citizens long before the conflict began. They were often denied basic rights and subjected to harmful practices like child marriage and sexual violence. During the war, many girls were victims of rape, forced labor, and trafficking. Some were sold as slaves, while others were coerced into sexual slavery and used as bargaining chips. In the refugee camps, the girls were not sent to boys-only areas like the lost boys. They were placed with family members or other families in the camp. But this did not protect them from abuse. They were expected to do all the domestic work, taking care of their younger siblings, cooking, and fetching water, often at great personal cost. The lost girls faced a double burden. They had to survive the war, and when they reached the camps, they had to survive the cultural norms that marginalized them. The few that were eligible for resettlement in the US were often denied because they were not considered orphans anymore. They had been living with families in the camp. As a result, few lost girls were resettled. The story of the lost boys and girls is one of unimaginable hardship, but also of survival and hope. Many have rebuilt their lives in the US, Canada, and other countries, but the scars of war and loss will never truly fade. They are survivors of one of the most brutal conflicts in modern history. Now, many of them are returning to South Sudan, not as victims, but as leaders, helping rebuild their country, providing humanitarian aid, and offering hope to the next generation. The lost boys and girls of Sudan reminds us that, even in the face of unimaginable hardship, the human spirit can endure. Their story is a testament to the strength and resilience of those who survive war and the power of hope to rebuild even the most shattered lives. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories from around the world. My name is Thank God, and this is SY Times.